Good morning. Since we have three wonderful authors to visit with this morning, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first writer on this panel, the mystery and thriller writers. It's Leslie Budewitz. Did I pronounce that correctly? Thank you. Okay, good. Leslie blends her passion for food, great mysteries, and her native Montana in the Food Lovers Village Mysteries for Berkeley Prime Crime. Her first book in the series is Death Al Dente. Leslie is also a lawyer. She graduated from Notre Dame Law School, practiced in Seattle for several years, then returned to Montana, where she still practices civil litigation and employment law. I call her a born-again Montanan. Her first book, Books, Crooks, and Counselors, How to Write Accurately About Criminal Law and Courtroom Procedures, won the 2011 Agatha Award for Best Nonfiction and was nominated for the 2012 Anthony and McCafferty Awards. McCafferty? Okay. She loves to cook, eat, hike, travel, garden, and paint, and not necessarily in that order. She lives in Northwest Montana with her husband, Don Beans, a musician, writer, and doctor of natural medicine, and their Burmese cat, Ruff, an avid bird watcher. Please help me welcome Leslie Budewitz.
So I think that we are going to have some fun this morning because I can hardly imagine three more different kinds of books than Gary's, Keith's, and mine. As Suzette's introduction hinted, mine is a lighthearted mystery set in a fictional version of Big Fork, and that's where I have lived for the last 15 years. These lighthearted mysteries are sometimes called a cozy, and I would hold up the cover and show you the gorgeous cover, but you can't really tell. So if you look at the bookmark or at the book outside in the book room, you'll see that, and actually I've got a few I can pass around. You can see that the cover shows a wonderful little village, a shop, and I'll just let you pass some of these around, and if you want to take one, great. If not, just keep passing it around. You'll at least see what the cover looks like. It's a little shop, and it has a little motto, "It takes a village to catch a killer." There's a cat on the cover, and that's why I mentioned the cat in the biography that Suzette shared with you, because in these kinds of mysteries there's often a cat or a dog. They are the community-oriented side of life, the lighter-hearted version. As Suzette said, I'm a Montana girl who grew up here and left and came back. I think that that's an important, a recurrent Montana story. Many of us tell that story. And so does Erin Murphy in the Food Lovers Village Mysteries. She grew up in Big Fork, Jewel Bay. I keep thinking of it, and I kind of interchange Big Fork and Jewel Bay because Jewel Bay is so closely based on Big Fork. But I had to call it something else so that I can kill people and still keep living there. Dawn and I kind of like living there. I want to tell you about what a cozy is. Some people don't like that term. I'm really happy with it because it describes the community aspect of these lighter-hearted mysteries. They are part of the traditional mysteries, the descendants of Agatha Christie. There are many descendants of Agatha Christie, but in this particular version, we're focused on the community itself. We've got a murder that comes from the outside, that comes from inside. If there's an FBI agent in a cozy, he's usually retired and working as a baker. We're not going to have any bomb threats. We're not going to have any international thrills or chills like we'll have in some of the other books you'll hear this morning. The sleuth is an amateur, usually female. She's both a bit of an outsider, which is why my gal Erin works so well, because she is a local who has left and come back, and she thinks she knows what's changed and what hasn't, but she's not always right. And so that makes for some of the conflicts and contrasts that are important in any mystery. But because she's also an outsider running this shop down in the heart of the village, she can ask questions that the official investigators can't. She can get at truths that they will never find, even though in this case the official investigator is a local girl as well. She does not have, the detective does not have the same access to people and their secrets that our amateur sleuth has. And I think that that's really important in this kind of mystery. The external investigation restores the community's external order, which has been damaged by the murder. But the amateur sleuth is the one who ultimately solves the crime. And she is essential because she restores the internal order of the community. And that is what these stories are ultimately about, is the community. Often there's a touch of humor, maybe even an Elvis impersonator. We do have one here, although he prefers to call himself a tribute artist. So I'm just going to jump right in and tell you a little bit more about this book and read a section for you, and then if we have time I can answer any of your questions. As a former lawyer, I'm not completely former, I do still practice. They never go anywhere without my notes because, I might need to refer to them. Erin is a young woman who, as I said, has just returned to her hometown to take over the struggling family business, which is a 100-year-old grocery and gift shop that she remakes into a local foods specialty market called the Merc, or the Mercantile. She decides that town needs a festival, and those of you who know Big Fork and Whitefish and the other small towns of Montana know we love our festivals. Well, we love them in our bigger towns too. There's a joke up there, another weekend, another festival. And so she decides, well, heck, one more. And she decides that she will start this Festa de Pasta de Jewel Bay. Why a Festa de Pasta? Because, as you can tell from her name, she's half Italian. Many of us have names that don't reflect our heritage, and that's something for her too. She's half Irish, half Italian. So she gets the town all riled up to start off this festival to kick off summer, and that's basically what it's about. The town did not have a summer opening festival. So there are restaurants and concerts, and every shop or business in the town has geared up for this Italian festival that's going to take place over the weekend. And they're starting off Friday night with a gala dinner catered by the local chefs in the courtyard that the Merc shares with Red's Bar, which is next door. Red's Bar is owned by old Ned Red Dunaway. His red hair has kind of faded, but he's still got the nickname. So, all is going well until the opening night dinner is beginning in the courtyard. Erin discovers that a decoration that was meant for the back gate got missed and didn't get put on. So she dashes out to the back gate to put it on and discovers in the back alley the body of Claudette Randall, the former manager of the Merc. So we will pick up on Saturday morning after the murder has been discovered. The murder was discovered on Friday night, and now we're Saturday morning. Inside the Merc, all seemed kosher. Other than a wine glass I'd left on the kitchen counter, there were few signs that we'd thrown a party out back, let alone one disrupted by murder. 6 chrome stools with red vinyl seats flanked the stainless steel counter that divided kitchen from selling floor. Fresca, I was still retraining myself to call her that, at least during business hours. Fresca is her mother, Francesca. Fresca had scrounged them from an old diner in Ponderay, 30 miles away, and recovered them. They looked as though they had always been there. I perched on one and sipped my latte, hot, smooth, and delectable. Then I broke into my croissant, its flaky pastry melting on my tongue, and the bittersweet chocolate inside. Divine. I heard a key in the front door. Footsteps echoed on the oak floor, then paused. "Who's there?" a voice called. "It's me, Mom." I swiveled on my stool. "Why are you sitting with the lights off?" She flicked the switch and the kitchen lit up. I hadn't minded the shadows. They suited my mood. Her olive skin looked ashen, but her dark eyes missed nothing as she gave me a slow once-over. You couldn't sleep either. I'd fallen asleep about the time Remy the rat and Linguini the kitchen boy, and that's a reference to the movie Ratatouille, had hatched their plot for culinary domination and woken up at 3 a.m. Despite my brain fog, it had taken only a moment to remember why I was asleep in the living room and why I was so upset. I'd tossed and turned on the bed till 7. Acting as if I felt festive, I'd pulled on a turquoise-tiered block print dress, stacked bright bangles on my left wrist, tucked the red boots back in my closet, and strapped on my brown leather Mary Jane clogs. With the right clothes, you can fool the world. But you can't fool my mother. In the bright light of morning in the murk, she brushed an imaginary stray hair off my face, then frowned at my food. I hope that's non-fat milk. With all the temptations around here, you're going to have to watch yourself. Oh, for Pete's sake. Claudette was killed last night, practically on our doorstep, probably because of me, and you're worried about my weight? Just be careful, darling. You do tend to seek comfort in food. And what do you mean, killed because of you? I invited her. Not logical, I knew, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I ripped into the last bit of pastry. We may not know what happened, but neither of us is to blame, she said. Why would you feel guilty? You didn't even know she was coming to the party. You didn't know she was back in town until Ted told us about the rumors. I could hear the anxiety in my rising voice. She didn't deserve to die that way, Fresca said. No one does. But it's not your fault. She sank onto the stool next to me. I've been racking my brain trying to imagine who could have done this or why. We sat in silence far longer than typical for 2 Italian girls, even 2 named Murphy. My brother-in-law likes to say that in our family, Murphy's Law means no silence can last longer than 2 seconds. About the festa, Mom. I needed to share my doubts. It's too late to cancel this weekend, but maybe it shouldn't be an annual thing. Maybe, don't you dare. She held up a graceful hand in the universal stop sign. Don't even think about quitting. Murphy girls don't quit. You weren't crazy about the idea in the first place. Not true, darling. It just seemed like a lot to take on so soon. But you've done a beautiful job. We needed a summer opener. Both the Chamber and the Village Merchants Association got behind you, and that says a lot. It said I would probably be recruited to lead one or the other before long. I just don't want the festa to be a constant reminder of Claudette's murder. I drained my latte and stood. We'll come up with something new if we need to. The front door chimed. If clothes make the man, they reveal the woman. And Tracy, the shop assistant, Tracy loved a bargain. The brighter the better. But today, she had not bothered trying to dress up her mood. In all my years at Save Club, I had never sent an employee home to change clothes, but Tracy's faded denim crops tight across the thighs and her ancient navy sweatshirt might make today the first. Tracy McCann, my mother said in a voice no daughter could ever misread. Are you dressed for work or the cleanup crew? Kind of nice to have a bad cop in-house. It doesn't matter, Fresca. Nobody's coming in today. Haven't you heard what they're saying? She gripped a Diet Coke can in a wax paper bag that likely held her morning maple bar. If she'd stopped at the convenience store as usual, she'd heard pure trash. When I'd approached the owner about the festa, she'd rebuffed me soundly. More village hoopla, she'd said, underscoring the animosity some highway business people carry for the downtown merchants. As if drawing more people to town for the weekend meant she'd sell less burnt coffee and stale donuts and less gas. Like what? No doubt the same rumors I'd heard in Le Panier. That Fresca threw Claudette out on her ear, that she came back with a vengeance and came here last night to confront the 2 of you, to show you up in front of the high muckety-mucks. Tracy's voice shook. Had I ever seen her without earrings? That's ridiculous. Fresca's back stiffened. It's what Ted said yesterday, and my neighbor this morning. We'll be lucky to make a sale all day. Fresca and I exchanged looks. The Murphy girls were on the same page. We've got extra 5s and 1s in the safe, I said. Tracy, you're dressed perfectly to pack up the decorations from last night. Get one of the guys in reds to help you haul the boxes down to the basement. You can change at noon when you go home to check on your dog. I'll check the stock, Fresca said. With the tourists returning, the pastas and sauces are really moving. Don't forget the jams and jellies. Tracy looked baffled. You mean gossip is a good thing? You mean gossip is a good thing? Yes. I mean, it's awful. But if people are talking about us, well, you know what they say. No such thing as bad publicity. I didn't want the festa associated with murder, but if it was, shame on us for not making the most of it. Tracy looked like she might puke, and not from the Diet Coke and maple bar. What about showing respect for the dead? Trace, we loved her too. But closing or acting glum won't honor her. Let's show this town how strong we are, and why Claudette loved the Merc and Jewel Bay. I had an idea. When you're done out back, help Fresca restock. I've got a project of my own. Upstairs in my office, I clicked on my laptop and scrolled through our photographs. Didn't take long to find a great shot. I cropped, cut and pasted, added text, and hit print. While the printer whirred, I dashed out back, my clogs clattering on the courtyard's pavers, and scooped up one of last night's flower arrangements. Inside, I placed the pot on the front counter next to a small display easel and added my spur-of-the-moment poster. The Merc remembers Claudette Randall, a bright flower. We love you. We miss you. And across the bottom, 15% of today's sales donated to the Jewel Bay Food Bank in Claudette's memory. It's perfect. Tracy burst into tears. My mother blinked back tears of her own and kissed my cheek. At 10, I flipped the hand-painted sign from closed to open, and customers began streaming in. And they weren't just browsing. They bought. We sold more Huckleberry Taffy before noon than in the last 2 weeks combined. Jams and jellies danced out the door, and wild choke cherry syrup sold like hotcakes. And every customer, without exception, spotted the picture of Claudette, dressed like an elf for last year's village Christmas walk, next to the antique cash register, and expressed sympathy. Late morning, another idea struck. I sprinted next door for a few baguettes. The summer I was 13, my parents took the family to France and Italy. My father's joke, how to disguise yourself as a Frenchman in Paris? Walk down the street carrying a baguette. How to disguise yourself as an American in Paris? Walk down the street eating a baguette. We slathered olive tapenade on some slices and goat cheese on others, and set platters of spur-of-the-moment snacks next to piles of red and white checked cocktail napkins, and promptly sold out of tapenade, goat cheese, and the handmade serving dishes. Though the thought turned my stomach and made my heart ache, apparently murder can be good for business. Thank you.
We have a couple minutes for questions.
Okay.
If you'd like to do.
Happy to. Yes. Anybody? I know it's early in the morning. You're not awake yet. Gwen, you ask questions for a living. Got one for me? Yes, back in the back.
So how do people in Bigport like the novels? Do they see themselves?
Yes, this is fun. People in Bigford, how do they like the novels? The village has been very, very good to me. We don't have a bookstore in Bigford these days, but there have been a couple of other shops.
You had a really nice one.
We did have a nice one. Unfortunately, it closed a few years ago. The owner retired and wasn't able to find another buyer.
Mm-hmm.
And so there have been a couple of other shops that have stepped up and carried the book for me. And people are actually having fun with it. I have heard many theories of the origins of certain characters, and the best part is none of them are right. Except, of course, that Red's bar is obviously the garden bar, but Ned and Ted are not at all related to Mr., who thinks the whole thing is hilarious. So that's fun. It's really nice when your friends don't mind it if you kill people outside their business. What else? Yes?
Okay, another. Were you in a book group?
A writing group?
A writing group that read your book as you went along?
No. I have been in writing groups. Many years ago, I lived in St. Ignatius, and I came down to Missoula when the Hellgate Writers still existed in the late 90s, and attended some classes through the Hellgate Writers, and was in a poetry writing group then. But in all the driving I did as a Montanan, especially when I was teaching at the law school, I listened to books on tape, and they were literally on tape in those days. And the Missoula Public Library has such a tremendous mystery collection that I listened to mysteries like crazy. Tony Hillerman, Sarah Paretsky, Sue Grafton, Elizabeth Peters, Alice Peters, and on and on. And so when fiction started to come out, it came out in the form of mystery. Partly, I think, because of my nearly 30 years at this point of practicing law, but also I've been feeding my brain mysteries. Then when I lived in the Mission Valley, I really didn't know any other mystery writers. So I joined Sisters in Crime, a national organization, and that has been a tremendous boon to me as a writer. I helped found a chapter within Sisters in Crime for unpublished writers. And by then we had the internet and we could communicate that way. And that's just been a tremendous thing that I recommend to mystery writers all the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And so we'd like to welcome Gary Cook.
Oh, yeah.
Gary is a sixth-generation Montana native who lives on an Indian reservation in Montana. He is a U.S. Marine combat veteran and former sheriff's deputy with years of experience working undercover. He worked for a Chinese trading company in Taiwan and elsewhere in Asia and Southeast Asia, and was a tenured professor at a Japanese university. He has been shot, stabbed, run over by his own motorcycle, and severely chastised by a group of motorcycle chicks. As Rick DeMarina said, Gary's writing convinces because, like Graham Greene, he knows his subject firsthand. His well-received second novel, Lone Walker, recently received a silver medal from the Independent Book Publishers Association for Best First Novel by a New Publisher. His latest novel, A Murder of Wolves, was set almost entirely in Montana. I'm pleased to introduce Gary C. Clark.
Thank you. Well, I know my bio reads a lot better than I look, so I'll try to muddle through this. I've never done this before. I'm a native Missoulian. I'm sixth generation Montanan, as she said. If you don't count the Indian blood, and I don't, because none of my relatives were ever tribal members. When I set out to write, I'm sorry.
Would you like to speak right into the mic?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
Because it's too low. Yeah. These books were meant to be part of a series, but it's not a series in the traditional sense. They're meant to follow generation by generation. For example, the main protagonist in this book is the uncle of one of the main protagonists in this book. This book represents the Vietnam War years and after the war years up to about the early 90s. So I'm sorry. This book is set entirely in the present today, and it features two guys who are veterans of Iraq, Afghanistan, some of the other stands and some of the islands in the Pacific that we've sent Special Forces people to. One character is former Special Forces, one is former Force Marine Recon. When I started writing, I swore when I started writing that I would never write this kind of book. I wasn't interested to write about war. I wasn't interested to write about cops. But over the years, largely in response to people who are taken far too seriously because of publishing companies that insist on billing best-selling writers as someone who writes the real deal, I found motivation to try to write the real deal. It's a lot more difficult than it sounds. For one thing, I'm paddling upstream. I'm paddling against all the mythical characters and all the mythical writing that you've read over the years, Tom Clancy, people like that. But don't get me wrong. I like to read mysteries. I like to read books that maybe, well, for example, the Jack Reacher series written by Lee Childs. I love those books. It's just Marvel comic books in print. It's great entertainment. You know, I'd rather read one of his books than watch a television program, that kind of thing. Well, My stories are meant to be a slice of real life, but real life to whom? Real life to the people that George Orwell labeled the hard men, the people who let us sleep well at night. In George Orwell's day, they were men for the most part. But today, these hard men who let us sleep well at night are fathers, brothers, sisters, the girl next door, the boy next door, some of the athletes that we watched our kids grow up with. They have an innate ability, it's in their DNA, to have the ability to be trained to become these hard men. They don't talk about their stories, they don't write about their stories. When's the last time you heard a story from a Delta Force operative or a Navy SEAL or a Marine Force recon? You just don't hear them. They can't talk to anybody. My goal is to tell their stories. So my stories are composites of their stories. My characters are composites of them. I formed them into something creative, something new, something that basically protects the not so innocent. So I'm not writing mysteries. I want my stories to be entertaining, and I think they are. In part, they're adventures, they're mysteries, they're noir. There's a lot of sex, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of action. They're replete with action and violence. But I try to make it as real as possible. I try to be the rabbit that leads you down the hole into a world that you only thought you could imagine, that you only think you know, and to try to give you a real piece of what these people do and who they become. I'm making this sound far too serious. I mean, people laugh out loud at some of the banter that goes back and forth between the characters and so on. I hope they're a lot of fun to read. I came to writing late in life. It was only totally by accident that somebody in the MFA program at the University of Montana discovered that I had a talent. Dick Hugo, Rick DeMarinis, Neil McMahon, Jim Welch, people like that were my mentors. That's who I learned how to write from. I didn't have a lot of time to write since those years because I had other things that I had to do. As I said, I came to writing late in life. Most of what I write about had already happened. I didn't set out like so many people have who have covered wars. I didn't set out to go to war so I could later come back and write about it. I just, one day somebody said, hey, you can write, why don't you write? Fine. So these are the results. As I said, everything I write is a composite of a story that somebody's told me. The characters are composites of real people. When I was trying to find a section to read in such a short period of time, I couldn't find a section that's representative of my stuff, because I don't seek to advance a plot. I seek, like Barbara Hand, to create a tapestry of life. All sorts of things weave together. It's the only way I know of to write. I can't do the Edgar Allan Poe method of writing mysteries where you start from the finish and work your way backwards to make sure that you've foreshadowed everything and put misleading clues in it and everything like that. I give my characters a catalyst, and then they just do their thing. I'm just a conduit for their stories. And like I said, these are stories based on real people and real events. I couldn't find any one section to read that might fit this. I mean, I apologize to all of you who are here for a mystery writer, because I'm sorry. I'm just not, there's mysteries, but I'm not a mystery writer. And the two mystery writers that I'm with are very excellent. I especially like Mr. McCafferty's ability to portray Montana, the countryside, the stream, the fish, the flies. And I think he's done us a real public service in that he's amply illustrated that a creature with a brain the size of a contact lens is smarter than most of the people we've elected to government office. Certainly more wily and harder to catch. This portion of the story reflects numerous conversations and help given to me by people who were some of the most famous U.S. Marine Corps snipers in Vietnam during the Vietnam War years. It also reflects hours and hours of conversation when I used to get together with a retired CIA agent from Missoula who was the CIA's area studies man in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. Before that, he was in the Army and responsible for rescuing downed Allied flyers who flew the hump and who, or for any reason, crashed and burned in the jungles of Burma. He was a great guy. He discovered people in Southeast Asia that had never seen an outsider. He recorded their language. He wrote articles for National Geographic and publications like that. And for some reason, he liked to talk to me. And he'd tell me stories. He'd never tell me his stories. He'd always tell me stories of people that he worked with. Probably because he's not allowed to tell his stories. I mean, he would tell stories that had to do with the countryside, with if you get bit by a snake, you die, because there's nobody to medevac you out of there, that sort of thing. So, what I'm going to read is a product of, I don't want to give you any kind of a spoiler, so I'm just going to read it, but it's a product of these snipers that I talked with, and with this ex-CIA guy that I talked to, and it's a story about a snake, a story about a king cobra. And I use stories about animals a lot as a doorway to help most readers get into the world that I'm trying to depict. If you can understand a bear hunt in Montana, for example, and everything that goes on with it, then the next step, the next doorway you go through is when that hunt involves people and not animals. It's a mindset that I try to put you in. So let me just read this hopefully short excerpt about a snake. I forgot my reading glasses yet. A half click or so from the mound, a cobra had appeared. The first king cobra he'd ever encountered in the bush. Seriously spooky, that snake. Pucker factor of at least 20 on a scale of 10. Feel like Batman. He'd been sitting hidden inside a stand of thick bamboo on the other side of a nearly dry stream bed, waiting for the afternoon rain so he could move down the open slope to the small mound with the big tree. And the snake had emerged from the grass on the lip of that far embankment. 1 second there'd been him and the mosquitoes and the ants, and before his brain could even process what he was seeing, a huge cobra, black at the head, flowed down the embankment to the stream bed, gliding over and around and between moss-covered rocks and debris. Nearly 15 feet of horror. It had stopped and for what seemed like a long time lay motionless, its olive body nearly invisible in the rocks and debris. Finally, it had raised its head slightly and flowed back up the embankment. At the top, a third of it still exposed on the embankment. It had sensed or smelled him and had risen, its sleek head like a malignant periscope above the grass, and rotated toward him, exposing an underside of gray-brown. It searched 45 degrees, back and forth, swaying from side to side, locking on to where he sat hidden and not even blinking in the thick, leafy bamboo. He could see white crossbars beneath an orange and yellow and black throat. No jungle animal or human would have known he was there. He knew that from experience. But the cobra had known and had locked onto him, its jet black eyes glinting. He'd clearly heard it growl. No hiss or spit or any of that. Growl. The most frightening sound he'd ever heard. He thought for sure it was going to come for him. Huang had taught him that king cobras had no fear. They were known to attack any living creature in their territory, elephants included. And for sure he was in its territory. And not only was he in its territory, but the terrain was too rough, the grass and low bamboo too thick for him to outrun it. He'd eased the selector switch to full auto and pushed the safety off, and as he did, the remainder of the cobra had retracted up the embankment, the head elevating even higher, hood spread white on the inside. It swayed from side to side, growling, its eyes pure black death, angry and no fucking doubt about it. He'd had the eerie feeling that it could read his mind. Sweat trickled down his back and along his rib cage, dripped from the corner of his right eye. If it came, it would go to ground, out of the grass and down the embankment and on him in seconds. He'd have to shoot it, and then the whole world would know he was there. Even now, just thinking about it, he could feel the hair stand up on the back of his neck. Folklore said that king cobras mated for life, and sometimes hunted in pairs. Kill one and the other would hunt you as long as it had a trail to follow. Where had he heard that? Kipling, maybe. The other one was in the bamboo with him. He'd suddenly been sure of that. That was why the one he was watching hadn't gone to ground. It was waiting for its mate to sneak up on him. He'd fought the nearly uncontrollable urge to see what was behind him. Was it cobras or black mambas that mated for life? There had been cobras in the Kipling stories his grandfather had read to him. The cobra could smell his fear. He was sure that it could. And he tried to hunch his back without moving, not taking his eyes off the snake swaying above the grass, hoping that if there was one behind him, it would strike his ruck and the radio inside. The cobra rotated its head away from him, its hood no longer spread, and moved farther into the grass, its head smoothly sinking out of sight. He sat there for a long time, more than an hour, waiting for the afternoon rains and the cobras to come. When the rain finally came, gray sheets of it obscuring even the embankment on the other side of the stream, he stood and forded the stream and climbed the embankment and hurried through the grass on the other side, down the long, mostly open slope to the mound. He suspected that the cobras, he thought of it now in the plural, knew the tree and the mound. They probably hunted here. And all through the long, wet night, he'd hoped that that was all they did here, hoped that it was not also their home. Well, there's a lot more that happens, of course. And he's just getting to where he's going to do what he's going to do. The real story behind the cobra that was told to me is this former CIA guy, the area studies guy. He was in this really rough country, probably somewhere in upland Thailand, maybe Laos, someplace like that. And he was a tall guy. He was like 6'5", 6'6". And he looked across the elephant grass, because he was tall enough to see across it. And there's a king cobra periscoped up there looking at him. Once they make eye contact, the cobra goes to ground. He can't run away. There's no way he can outrun this snake. He's in thick grass. So what he did is he quickly trampled out a small area in the grass, took his jacket off, and hoped that he was choosing the side that the snake was going to come at him from. And indeed it did. It came out of the grass. Cobras don't strike. They rear up and they fall on something. Came out, reared up, he threw his jacket over it. And the thing proceeded to just try to demolish the jacket. And he just beat feet as fast as he could out of there. He wasn't sticking around to do anything with that cobra. So that's where that story came from. And as far as this guy being a former sniper and everything, that's just, he's obviously at home. You know, so that's an example of how I use stories that were told to me to try to put it in a fictional context.
And we have time for a couple questions.
Okay.
You said that you give your characters a catalyst and then just let it take them where they go. What would a catalyst be? What kind of catalyst?
Well, some sort of traumatic event. In this book, the two guys are undercover sheriff's deputies. And they do some stuff that they shouldn't do. They know better. But because it's Montana and because of the people that they're going up against, they're sort of, you know, they've kind of got their noses in the air and they end up getting their asses handed to them, so to speak. And they're not sure why, and they're not sure what's going on, and they're obviously in the middle of something they just can't get a handle on. And that's how it is in real life. When you investigate something for real, you don't know the end. You don't know who, it's just a fog. It's all these people, it's all these places. It's this thing, this environment that you have to work your way through if you're going to do it. So, and if I'm just true to the characters, I mean, these are all pretty much alphas. You know, men, women, it doesn't matter who the characters are. You know, you get them lined out in a direction and they're just gonna go. And it's kind of fun writing because I'll be writing along, you know, I'll write 5, 10 pages and I'll go, no way. Boom, there's no way she would do that, think that, or he would do that, think that, or anything. You know, this vocabulary, or this dialogue just, you know, it resonates in all the wrong ways. So it's pretty easy. You know, they guide me in that way. But you know, the flip side of that is I sometimes don't know where the hell this story's going. You know, I got to end this thing sometime.
You've talked about your relationship with people that brought you a lot of the ideas for the story. Do you hunt them out, or do they hunt you out?
You know, kind of both. I drive my wife and daughter nuts because I have an ability to strike up a conversation with almost anybody and to just kind of dig at them until I was a really good interrogator. So it's kind of a combination of both. I mean, the reason why I went back to school, I was injured and I was waiting to take a job with the Billings Sheriff's Office. And I got thinking about it and I thought, you know, I worked years undercover and I'm sneaky and duplicitous and I can make myself be anybody I want to be. I think I'll be an investigative reporter. So I trotted up to the J School and, you know, Charlie Hood pretty much recognized that I had the qualities that might make a good investigative reporter. Unfortunately, my degree was in Mandarin Chinese, which really doesn't serve as a good basis for a master's degree in journalism. So he said, go back to school, get a quick degree in history, and take some writing classes. Well, the only thing I could find was a writing class. Turned out to be a graduate level seminar in the MFA program. And here I am. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
In the effort to allow equal time, we're probably going to go a little bit afternoon. I hope that that's okay with you, maybe 12:05. But I'd like to go ahead and introduce Keith McCafferty. He is the survival and outdoor skills editor of Field and Stream. He has written articles for publications as diverse as Fly Fisherman Magazine, Mother Earth News, Gray's Sporting Journal, and the Chicago Tribune, and on subjects ranging from mosquitoes to wolves to mercenaries and exorcism. Based in Montana and working on assignment around the globe, Keith has won numerous awards, including the Robert Traver Award for Angling Literature. He has twice been a finalist for the National Magazine Award. His nonfiction books include the L.L. Bean Family Camping Handbook and the L.L. Bean Hiking and Backpacking Handbook, which his son illustrated. Keith's first novel, The Royal Wolf Murders, was a Book of the Month Club and Mystery Guild selection. His second novel in the series is The Gray Ghosts. Please welcome Keith McCafferty.
Hello.
Now, what am I doing off this line? Well, that was interesting, Gary. Where's Gary?
I'm still here.
Yeah. Because, you know, my whole life was snakes when I was a child. Now, I almost went to graduate school and to study snakes. And it actually taught me lessons as a writer, because when I was a little kid, when I grew up in Appalachia, everybody was scared to death of timber rattlesnakes and copperheads. And every snake they saw was a copperhead, even though, of course, 90% of them weren't. And when my grandmother, my nana, we called her, who was famous for her squirrel gravy, when she would come stay at our house, she would stuff towels under all the doors where she was, because she knew I had snakes. And later on, I worked with snakes, and I actually was in charge of the care of a cobra once, an Indian cobra, not a king cobra. I stayed away from them. So, and the other thing was, Leslie is talking about the cozy things. Well, a few months ago, one of my friends is Nevada Barr. I don't know if you've heard of her.
Yeah.
And she's been a big promoter of my books. And I sent her a picture of me. Well, I have this cat that I sometimes write with this cat on my lap. I do all the time, actually. And she says, ooh, she says, you should put that on the back cover. She says, you'll get all the cozy readers. Well, I didn't know what that meant. So then a couple weeks ago, I was invited to speak at BoucherCon. BoucherCon is the big international mystery writers association. With not an association, but it's a big event. And so I was walking by the panel rooms, and one of them, you know, the title of the panel was, How Far Can You Go and Still Be Cozy? So at that point, I thought, well, I gotta find out what this means, and I found out what it was, but I didn't know. So anyway, when I sign books or whatever, I'll usually, I mean, I've got cards like Leslie does, but I'll usually give out photographs, like as bookmarks. And I've got some of them that are cats, my cat, and I find that the women pick my cat. I mean, I've got actual tigers from when I worked in India and took photographs of tigers. But anyway, I'll pass those around, and everybody feel free to take one. You can go through them. I'll have to put on glasses, too. I did remember them, barely. So anyway, I'm a field and stream writer. I did that for 37 years. And when I grew up, my dream was to meet Al McLean, who was a fishing editor of Field and Stream, take his job, and marry his daughter. His daughter was a beautiful girl, young woman. And I thought, well, how can I impress Al McLean? Well, one thing Al McLean could do that very few people in the world could do is he could take a fly line, a regular double taper 7-weight, what would be that equivalent today. And he could cast the whole line without a rod, 90 feet without a rod. I thought, I'm going to learn how to do that. It must have taken me 3 months, but I learned how to do it. But the short part of the story is, I never did meet Al McLean. I never did marry his daughter. But I didn't take his job, but I sort of came close. And the problem as of 4 or 5 years ago was I was, in a sense, almost too successful. I've written, I don't know how many, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles, I think close to 2,000 for Field and Stream alone. I once had 8 articles with my name on them in, I think, the February 2008 issue of Field and Stream. And it was like, at that point, you're sort of plagiarizing yourself, sometimes. So they sent me on this survival, I'm the guy they'd send into the woods with, dressed like this in November to survive for a few days. And I had to do that and make a long story, because it really was a long time out there. The second night, I think I was in a debris hut, which Gary will know, the debris hut. They're just buried in there. And at that point, you got to do push-ups every 20 minutes, to stay alive. And I thought, if I ever get out of here, I'm going to write that novel I always wanted to write. I can't do this all my life. So that's what I did. And I got lucky. I got contracts with Viking Penguin, and I decided to write a series of books, sort of centered in the part of Montana that I knew. And at that time, writers like C.J. Box and Craig Johnson had pretty much staked out the territory of the iconic, Western lawmen in these extraordinarily big and very rural and unpopulated counties in Wyoming. But that way of life that they were writing about there it's really limited to a few of those areas. And most of the West is, it's changed quite a bit. I've lived in Montana for more than 30 years, and I've seen it change a great deal. And, it's basically changed from ranching, mining in a lot of areas to tourism, recreation, the subdivision of the big ranches, fly fishing in particular, which is like a $600 million a year industry just here in Montana alone, which is an enormous amount of money. So I decided to do that and write a character who had 3 or 4 different jobs, because everybody in Montana has 3 or 4 different jobs just to make ends meet. A watercolor artist, a fly fishing guide, and a private detective. And although I don't have the law background that Gary has, it was sort of natural for me because my uncle was a game warden. I've been involved with the Sheriff's Department in Gallatin County for a while. And I know some of the people there. I'm involved in search and rescue. My first cousin, Billy McCafferty, is the police chief of Steubenville, Ohio. If any of you have heard of Steubenville, it's because it's now the most notorious small town in the country because of the horrific rape that occurred there last year and the social media coverage of it. So Billy's been very involved in that. Anyway, so I started writing these books, and at this point I've written 3. The first one was the Royal Wolf Murders, and it's out in paperback now. And I got good news about that book. That will be, it's one of the 3 finalists for the High Plains Award this year. And, but I'm not going to win because the other 2 finalists are Gretel Erdrich and Richard Ford. But I might get to meet them anyway, And so the second book I wrote was The Gray Ghost Murders. And that one is out now. And I also got good news about that one because that was just selected by the Oprah Winfrey Book Club, which is maybe sounds like a bigger deal than it is. I don't really know. It's like, one of 5 addictive mysteries or whatever. And the third one I wrote is called Dead Man's Fancy. And I'll read just a short bit about this. It seems like I'm on the road every weekend doing stuff sometimes, but the truth is, the thing that I don't think people like to really hear people read. I think they like to hear them talk more. So I'll try to make this brief. And I'll just skip around and I'll just read for maybe 10 minutes. So this is, I have 2 main characters actually, Sean Stranahan. I got his name because when I used to write so many articles, you would have to write under a pseudonym sometimes. And so I wrote under the pseudonym Sean Stranahan, so when it came to picking a character, for my book, it was like, well, it's pretty easy. And, but my co-main character is Martha Edinger, the sheriff. And they're on a search for a young missing woman, a search and rescue search. When she awoke, it was so light that Martha thought it was dawn. She pulled up her jacket cuff to glance at the luminous hands of her watch. 3 a.m. There was just the diffuse light of the moon reflecting off the snow. She unbuttoned the waist of her pants to take the pressure off her bladder. Walt was still snoring, Walt's our deputy, a line of blown snow in the center crease of the hat tilted over his face. The man could sleep through anything. Still, he was at least marginally a human being, and she would not rather have been alone. "Oh, quit stalling," she muttered. She shuffled off behind the trees. Her face relaxed as she relieved herself. Men on a search, they just unzipped. They could care less she was standing 10 feet away. She commented on it once to Harold, that time when they were hunting elk in the Badger 2 medicine. He told her that in uniform she was just one of the guys. It's respect, that's the way I'd look at it. Then he shuffled a few feet away and pissed on the campfire coals. Martha shook her head. Harold. She kicked pine needle duff over the lance her urine had cut in the snow and went to check on the horses. "Hey, girl, it'll be light in a jiff now," she said, coming around the trees and then abruptly stopping. Directly in front of her, a little to the left of the 2 horses, A bulky shape loomed, blacking out a section of forest. For a second, Martha thought it was a moose. But of course it couldn't be a moose. Petal and Big Mike would have gone crazy. Then she heard the nicker and knew the horse that she'd heard earlier had followed his nose into camp. Martha started talking in a low voice, and immediately the horse advanced, extending its neck. Martha rubbed her fist under its eye. It was a gelded quarter horse, a bay with a crop mane and irregular forehead star. "Where did you come from?" She switched on the low beam of her headlamp and ran it across the saddle. A braided lead rope was neatly coiled and secured to a D-ring ahead of the left fender, indicating the rider probably hadn't dismounted before separating from the horse. "Thrown?" Martha added a stop to the high line so the quarter horse couldn't trample into Petal or Big Mike, clipped the lead to the halter, and considered the sky. She went back to the shelter and buckled on her duty belt. She thought of waking Walt, but what was the point? He couldn't go where she was going, and she was going, for the moon was showing only because it had found a hole in the clouds. It could snow again at any time, and the tracks the horse had left would be erased. So I'm just going to read sort of the end of that chapter after she sort of backtracks this horse. Going down with the light tight in her right fist, this is a carnivore tracking light, which is one of the ones that if you hit it, if it illuminates blood, it just jumps off the ground. Inadvertently switching the button to the tracking mode, she felt her breath catch. Before her, the circular opening in the trees appeared to be dusted pink. The snow pushed up into irregularly spaced moguls. It was as if someone had spilled dozens of weakly flavored cherry snow cones. Martha stood and tentatively toed the snow under her boot. Immediately it shone with brilliant crimson dots that appeared to levitate a few inches above the ground. It was blood. She knew then that it was all blood. Because it had been sifted over, the color did not jump into the air, but rather pulsed from beneath the snow. The effect was startling. The forest floor all around her appeared to be radioactive with a diffused neon glow. Her nostrils flared at the iron metal scent. "Oh shit," she said under her voice. She rested her thumb on the hammer of the revolver. Again her attention was drawn to the log. She turned her eyes from it and then back. Something was ticking at her brain. Why wasn't it covered with the snow that blanketed the other downfall? She took a step toward it. She took another. She stopped. She knew it wasn't a log. In the eerie pinkish light, the man appeared younger than she'd thought he'd be. With his innocent, almost serene expression, he looked little more than a boy who'd laid down and fallen asleep with his eyes open. Or at least his right eye, for his face was tilted to the side. She was so focused on the face that for a moment she did not notice that his posture, his body bent backward, was caused by the bulk of what he was lying on top of. She felt the hairs lift at the back of her neck. A sharp pain pulsed behind her eyes. She shook her head to clear it. It was not a mound of snow, as she first thought. The young man was draped over the eviscerated rib cage and front quarters of an elk carcass. Martha thought of the wolves she and Walt had heard earlier. But if the elk was a wolf kill, where were the tracks? And the man, had he died from head trauma or from spinal fracture when the horse bucked him and he fell onto the carcass? She swept the carnivore light over his body, the LEDs reacting to a large stain of blood in the area of the groin. Though she could see no obvious sign of injury, the fabric under the waistband of the man's jeans was tented up, as if a stick were protruding. Martha's smile was sour. If Walt was here, he'd make a comment, say something about the man going out with a heart-on, dying happy. Humph. She bent down, then jerked back up as her gorge rose. She swallowed bile, steeled herself, and gingerly unsnapped the man's jeans. She worked the zipper down and pulled the fabric over the protrusion. It looked like a sharpened stick had stabbed upward into the man's back and punctured the lower abdomen, from which it protruded 4 or 5 inches. Martha touched the object with the back of her fingernail. Hard as bone. She turned her back on the body and drew out her radio. "What do you have, Martha?" Kent's voice had some gravel in it after relaying messages all night. "I found the wrangler. His horse wandered into camp and I backtracked him to where he got thrown. He's dead." Kent told her to stay where she was. He'd relay her coordinates to Harold, who was the searcher closest to her up on the head wall. So you figure he died in the fall? That was my first thought, but I don't know, Jace. He has an elk antler sticking out of his gut. Maybe you better tell me about it. I'll tell you about it, but right now I gotta throw up. She made it to the edge of the timber before heaving. She grabbed a handful of snow to wash her mouth out, found that her hands were trembling, and sat down on a log that actually was a log. She felt empty inside, but the bad taste was gone, replaced by something else, not exactly a taste, but more of an odor that exuded from her body. It was the odor of fear. She'd smelled it before when she found herself on a heartless breast of snow and wilderness, felt the dread gather in the limbs of the trees. The scream that came from her lungs, she couldn't believe she'd made it. God help me, she thought. But it was real, it had to be, for the wolves had heard. The first one answered from a long way off. The second was closer. So that's just the beginning. I mean, I've got more, but I know that we're running late, so.
We do have time for a couple
Sure.
questions.
Give me a question. Anything.
What was that reading from? Which one of your books?
Oh, that's from Dead Man's Fancy. So that's a book that will be published. This is what, this is one of those reader's copies or whatever they're called, So that one will be published in February.
You got a cover on yours,
A cover on what?
on your reader's copy. Mine's just.
Oh, yeah, well, that's the one thing we go back and, that's the only thing I argue with Penguin Press about occasionally, is the covers. Although I know the covers have been, they're pretty striking and it's helped sells the books, I work with a cover artist named Jim Tierney, and he's put flies on the covers of a couple of them. This one doesn't have a fly on it, but I have a fly in the middle of it. So I'll show you one weird thing. And I brought this for another reason, but I got it here. So what I do is I've tied flies my whole life, since I was 4 years old, actually. And so I tie the flies, and then I'll send them to, so this is the fly for this latest book. I'll send them to my agent. This one's inscribed to him, to my publisher, and then to Nevada Bar, and other friends.
So is the name of the fly Dead Man's Falling?
Dead Man's Fancy, yeah. But this is the first one that I decided, well, I've done 2 of these now. On the third one, I'm going to be allowed to make up my own, So it's just made up. Anybody can come up and take a look at it. It's my own, it's like a steelhead pattern, Anyway.
Another question?
Sure.
Why did you choose to make Stranahan a painter? He doesn't seem to do much painting. He's always.
Well, he does in the first book. He still does some. He works on commission. Well, the real reason is my son does the same work. My son does a lot of different things, and he's a very good artist himself. But he's a watercolor artist. And so I thought, well, I can refer to him. He's my expert, It's like I have people in police departments that I go over stuff with. Well, if you're going to have an artist, you better sort of know what you're talking about.
I thought maybe you painted yourself.
No, I always want to, but I think it skips a generation, like they say. My mother was a good painter. My son's a wonderful artist. He actually did, artwork for Field and Stream magazine when he was 12 years old. And at that time, it was about the biggest outlets for illustrative art in the country. And he was competing against the best in the country. So he's very good. But it's like writing, it's hard to make a living. Everybody says, well, I was a magazine writer, and I was a successful magazine writer. So I went from being, when everybody tells you, well, it's almost impossible to make a living as a magazine writer. So I went from that to writing novels where it is impossible.
Anyway.
Well,
okay. Thank you, Gary.
Sure.